project because I don't like microphones. So, but if you have trouble in the back, just give me a signal and I'll try to speak up a bit more. So I'm Janelle Olberding. I currently teach English over in Glendive at Dawson County High School. So I just appreciate you all coming today, and I want to thank the fine folks here at the archives for allowing me to be here, because I love any opportunity to visit Butte. I got into this particular topic when I was in graduate school, and at the time I was working in public health and doing a little bit of family research, and found that my family had a bit of history with influenza in 1918, and that's what really got me onto this track, was looking at this, and some very specific reasons why I turned to Butte specifically, and that's what we'll get into today. So Butte at this time, so right about the time that they're hit with the pandemic, Butte's just in an incredible state of transition. So by 1916, it's the largest city in the Northern Rockies. Had just exploded in population, and we have all kinds of things going on with the Granite Mountain disaster and Frank Little and all of the labor issues. And then right after all of this stuff, before things even really settle down, if they ever did settle down in early 20th century Butte, we've got influenza coming on the scene here. But I wanted to share a little bit of information just about what influenza is, so we're all kind of on the same page, because typically we'll hear someone say that they have the flu, and what they're suffering from is maybe some sort of gastrointestinal thing with vomiting and all of that stuff. But what we're talking about with influenza is a respiratory illness that's caused by a virus, so transmitted with coughs and sneezes and droplet exchange and all of those things. So flu has an incubation period of 1 to 4 days, so you can transmit influenza up to a day before you even have symptoms, and up to 7 days after, which is kind of important for what we'll talk about later. And then the symptoms of the flu, you start out just with extreme fatigue, muscle aches, chills, very high fevers, and then what's usually a really dry, unproductive cough. Sometimes it can be a little productive, but mostly it's just this dry, deep cough. And this was the case in 1918, as well as seasonal influenza and outbreaks that we see today. But 1918 differed really in its severity. So many of the infections in 1918 advanced to pneumonia. So if we look at death records and death certificates, what we'll see oftentimes is that the primary cause of death is listed as pneumonia, and influenza was this contributing factor because the cases just advanced. So when this happens, when people get pneumonia, they get this inflammation of the lungs, and they will start, that cough will become productive, and they'll start to cough up this bloody, frothy sputum. And in 1918, what was seen, what was very disturbing, was the lack of oxygen traveling around the body would cause this condition called cyanosis, which is where the extremities, so the fingers, toes, noses, ears would just turn a bluish, black, dark color because the body just wasn't getting enough oxygen. So when this happened, it was kind of a sign that the patient didn't have very much longer left. The other thing that sets the virus, the strain of 1918, apart from most strains that we see from seasonal influenza was just the speed at which it occurred. So we have a hospital administrator up in Glasgow that said some persons hardly know they're sick until they're dying. An epidemiologist with Yale said we have a number of cases where people were perfectly healthy and died within 12 hours. And finally, a doctor with the Navy said the onset's very sudden, the patient sometimes passing from an apparently well condition to almost prostration within 1 or 2 hours. So I've read anecdotes too about, a gentleman stepping on a streetcar to ride home, and by the time the streetcar is to a stop, he's in his seat dead because it just struck so suddenly. So people apparently healthy would experience maybe just a little bit of those initial symptoms and then just progress right to the end very quickly. The pandemic itself of 1918-1919 came in 3 waves. So the spring of 1918 is when it first started, but it was really just a minor kind of epidemic outbreak at this time. So epidemiologists didn't really relate it to what happened later in the year until years later when they looked at everything as a whole. What we'll spend our time talking about is the autumn and winter of 1918 and 1919. That's when Butte was hit, and when most of the world experienced the big upsurge in cases. And then there was a resurgence of the flu again in the spring of 1919. And what's unfortunate about that is that a lot of the people that died in the spring of 1919 had the flu earlier that winter, that fall, and just their immune system hadn't recovered enough to fight it when they got sick in the spring. Still to this day, though, there's really no solid answers on where the virus started and where this whole thing began. Some epidemiologists say that it started in Kansas in the spring of 1918 and moved with troop transports with the Army just to Army bases around the states and then overseas. Others say it started in East Asia, where most of our influenza epidemics originate, but there's really nothing confirmed yet. What we do know is that this was the most, by hands down, the most deadly influenza pandemic ever seen in recorded history. So when we're talking about 1 year time period here, we have 50 million people worldwide died of influenza. In the United States alone, we have 675,000, approximately 675,000, which is 13 times the seasonal average for influenza. And then in just Montana, we have 5,000 deaths, which at that time was approximately 1% of the state's population in 1 year died of influenza. And then we look at Butte. Butte was responsible for 1/3 of those about 5,000 pandemic deaths in Montana. So that's what really got me focused on Butte, was why such a high number. The city, although it's the largest city in the state, didn't hold 1/3 of the state's population. So why this huge mortality rate that we have here? So what I started to look at was 3 specific factors, and that's what we'll dig into. So I wanted to look at demographics. So the population that lived here, the people, was there something about the population makeup that made people susceptible? No discussion of Butte in the early 20th century is complete without talking about working conditions. So we have to look at that as well. And also the living conditions here in the city. So those are the 3 things that we'll focus on. Before we get into it, I wanted to give a little bit of information about how I went about gathering all of this. So I spent many hours right across the hall over here looking at all of the death certificates that the archives have. So the city of Butte recorded 707 deaths that listed influenza as either the primary cause of death or a contributing factor between September of 1918 and February of 1919. And those are the numbers I really looked at. Now that's certainly not a total of all the influenza deaths during that time, but it's enough for us to be statistically significant and be able to make some hard conclusions about things. Some other things that I used, so I used census records from 1910 to kind of compare general population to influenza victims. Although they're a few years old, they're still I found them to be the most complete population statistics out there for us to use. And then just some various other works, public health service reports, some other secondary works on the pandemic and Butte in general, and I can give a list of those specifically when we're done. So the first thing that you'll notice if you read anything about the influenza of 1918, 1919, was the age group that fell victim to it. And what's notable about this particular strain is that adults between the ages of 20 and 40 accounted for nearly half of all influenza deaths in the United States. And that's quite something, because if we take a look at the type of mortality curve that influenza usually makes here, we have excess deaths in infants and young children, with mortality dropping off in adolescence and middle age and early adulthood, and then picking up about age 70 to 75, and then excess mortality in older adults. But what happened in 1918 and 1919 is we get this very odd mortality. We can't even call it a curve, and it's not even really a W. It's this odd shape. We have excess mortality, again, in very young children and infants, with a drop-off in late childhood and adolescence, and then this very steep uptick in early adulthood and middle age. And then what's really notable is this decline here in late adulthood. So older adults, 75 plus, who are usually most susceptible, were actually least susceptible in 1918, which is quite notable. And there's a few theories on why that might be that I'll share with you. But this is important for Butte because at that time about 54% of the city's population was in that susceptible age range here. 72% of the city's pandemic victims were between the ages of 20 and 44. So this mortality it's, again, not even a curve, but this mortality rate that we have here, we see this just sharp uptick about age 20 to 44 in mortality here in Butte. So one of the reasons that scientists have said this could possibly be is that the influenza virus of 1918-1919 was so strong that it produced this kind of ironic twist of fate for a lot of victims. And that some people with the strongest immune systems actually ended up falling victim because of ARDS, acute respiratory disease syndrome. And what it is just immune system overreaction. So what would happen is these young adults with these strong immune systems would become infected, and their immune systems would just begin this massive and immediate attack on the virus. So there's immune proteins just released in massive doses into the body. But what would happen is that the immune response was so large that it would end up overwhelming the victim's lungs. So the lungs would fill with blood, fluid, and other types of immune debris, I suppose, for lack of a better term. And the lungs would just cease to function. They would be so weighed down and so filled with fluid and stuff that they wouldn't be able to work. So at autopsy, what doctors would find is they would open up the victim and find the lungs just very heavy and fluid filled. And so again, in this ironic kind of twist, the victim's immune system was what actually ended up killing them. And looking through all those death certificates, every now and then one would pop out at me. And there was one when I was thinking about ARDS that popped out, and it was a young Norwegian immigrant, and his cause of death was listed as influenza and lung congestion. And so I can only speculate on that he might have been one of the victims of this type of, this ARDS, this overactive immune response here. Another reason that, that younger adults might have been more susceptible has to do with acquired immunity. And that's when immune systems develop a memory for foreign substances and they learn how to attack them. So this is how vaccines work. Our bodies are introduced to this new microbe and it learns how to fight it off. So the next time it's seen, it already has the immune proteins and things available that can attack it. In 1892, there was an influenza epidemic that scientists later discovered had a virus that was very closely related to the virus of 1918-1919. The thing was, this particular epidemic was limited to the United States. So it would protect those born in America in or before 1892, or those that had immigrated prior to that time. So there's a large bit of the population here that's left out of that. So younger people are left out that are born later than this. Excuse me. And also immigrant populations that came over about the turn of the century didn't have the benefit of being exposed to this earlier virus and possibly building some immunity to that. And what that gets us into is the next susceptible population, which were the immigrant population. Around the United States, immigrant populations had higher mortality rates than native-born Americans. Acquired immunity could be to blame for this. It could be due to a lack of exposure to disease in wherever they had lived before. So we think about the Irish, maybe some of them might have lived in communities very similar to Butte and working and living conditions. And we take maybe someone from the forests of Scandinavia or the farms of Eastern and Northern Europe where they're not exposed to as much and don't have the immune response to deal with things, perhaps. And then we have to think about cultural factors too. Unfamiliarity with how American public health and healthcare systems worked, language barriers, and just belief systems, or just unwilling to go and ask for help if things got bad. So there are some possible reasons for this. But if we look at ethnicity in Butte, over 30% of the population at this time was foreign-born, and 70% of those immigrants were in that susceptible age range of 20 to 44. So we have a very large segment of the city's population who has 2 identified risk factors for falling victim to influenza in 1918. So if we look at our population in the city as a whole, Native-born Americans outnumbered immigrants in Butte by more than 2 to 1. But what's interesting is that both populations died in nearly equal numbers during the pandemic. So if our mortality rate kind of held true to population as a whole, we'd expect to see about 130 immigrant deaths from influenza, and not the about 315 that I found in the records. So it's quite an unbalanced ratio there. The numbers also indicate that along with immigration status, specific country of birth and origin played a role in mortality. So if we look specifically at Butte's Irish and English populations, the largest immigrant groups, they had a lower mortality rate than, for instance, the Finnish and the Austrian immigrants had more than twice the amount of deaths from influenza during this time. And we can kind of speculate about the reasons, maybe acquired immunity or living conditions, back in Europe. And there's some other things that we'll get into later that I think play a large part in that as well. Finally, we have to look at gender too. Again, all across the United States, the male mortality rate exceeded the female mortality rate by 50%. Not just here in Butte, but everywhere. But in Butte, males outnumbered females, but not at the 2 to 1 ratio that the mortality rate suggests. So we have a male mortality rate of about 2.3%, female of about 1.1, but that doesn't match our population.
Somebody's late.
So again, we can only really speculate on the direct causes of that unbalanced mortality rate with gender. We can say that possibly some cultural factors are maybe in play here. So men typically spend more time outside of the home. You can't miss work. You miss a day at work in the mines, and there's 3 guys willing to take your place, so you just have to go to work if you're sick or not. They're less likely to stay home and rest when they're ill. They're out daily, coming into contact with all kinds of new microbes and viruses and germs, so that can wear down your immune system, or consequently it can give you a stronger one, which then makes you more likely to fall victim to ARDS. So there's really no solid answers here as to why males suffer more than females, but it's an important distinction to make. But what really got me to thinking was, why Butte? Why Butte with this high mortality rate compared to the rest of the state? Because if we look at Montana as a whole and the population demographics around the state, they're really not all that different from Butte. So Montana has a young population during this time. Most people are, 20 to 44 in age. There's a lot of communities in Montana with large immigrant populations. There's more males in the state than females everywhere, not just in Butte. So why the difference in mortality rates here? What we really have to look at is what's different is the setting. So we've got mostly rural settings compared to Butte, which was at the time about 3 times the size of Great Falls, which was the next biggest city in the state then. So by far the largest urban area in the state. And then we have to look at economic factors. So agriculture in most other parts of the state versus industry, specifically underground mining here in Butte. So when we look at the urban and the industrial factors and the conditions that it caused here, we have to always talk about working conditions underground. So, we've all heard the horror stories about working underground in the early 20th century, how dangerous it was, how common death and injury were. Long shifts, thousands of feet underground, very poor sanitation because we have human waste, animal waste, contaminated water supplies, unclean drinking water. No ventilation systems until sometime in the 20s, so we have just hot, stagnant air underground. And then hot temperatures over 100 degrees, high humidity levels. So working underground was not the healthiest place to be, no matter what happened. But we really have to look at, and what I really wanted to look at was air quality, because that's important, because that's how influenza and a lot of disease spreads, is through the air. So in 1917, the United States Public Health Service released a report about Butte and looking at working conditions underground. And what they found was at least 20% of the underground workers who'd been employed 5 years or more in the Butte mines had miner's consumption, which is kind of this general term for any type of respiratory illness. So 20% of the men that had worked underground for a time were susceptible, already had some type of respiratory illness, some chronic respiratory disease. In 1910 to 1918, about 37% of Butte's residents were underground miners. But what's interesting is that the miners accounted for 42% about of Butte's pandemic deaths. And I think that's quite noteworthy because compared to some of the other really unbalanced mortality ratios that we've seen with gender and age and ethnicity, this one's fairly even. You know, I don't think it's enough to say for certain that working underground was this huge risk factor for influenza. So again, it's not really large enough to pinpoint underground mining as a really huge factor. Of course it played a role, but I don't think it can take a brunt of the blame here. So what I was thinking when I was looking at these numbers is I said, okay, this is why I'm going to make this argument that just living in Butte itself was probably the largest risk factor for falling victim to influenza in 1918. So between 1911 and 1916, that same U.S. Public Health Service report that talked about miners' consumption noted that Butte's death rate from tuberculosis was more than double the national average. And that's not just underground miners, that's everyone. That's all of the city's residents taken into account during that time. And a 1912 report from the Silverboe County Board of Health that was looking at tuberculosis and its risk factors within the city concluded that the conditions on the surface have a greater influence on the high death rate from tuberculosis than do the conditions in the mines. So even though they're looking at TB here, I think some of the same risk factors and the same things apply if we're looking at influenza. So everybody, underground miner or not, was subject to Butte's horrible, horrible air quality during this time. So the smelting process, I've read stories about, holding rags over faces just to walk down the street, carrying lanterns in the middle of the day because sometimes it's too dark to see because of all the smoke, and the toxins and the chemicals that smoke releases. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, the sulfur dioxide, short-term exposure, so that's just about 1 to 4 hours, can cause bronchoconstriction, which is a narrowing of air passageways, and increased asthma symptoms. And long-term exposure, like what Butte's residents would have experienced, can lead to lung infection and chronic respiratory disorders. So, air quality right there is a huge factor in, just healthy lungs and healthy immune systems. And this is what everyone in Butte was exposed to. The other thing is just overcrowding and poor sanitation. So that 1912 Silverboe County Board of Health report found that At times, there could be up to 7 to 9 people living in about 3 rooms per house. So, and you're keeping your windows closed because you don't want to let that horrible air from outside in. So we've got a limited amount of airspace per person with very little ventilation. So the indoor air, while maybe a little bit better than the outdoor air, was still not fantastic. And poor sanitation, so improper sewage, household waste disposal, so toilets outdoors, cesspools, we're throwing our household refuse outside. Miners' wives and others make a little extra income by selling some eggs or some milk, but I've got to keep my chickens or my cow in the backyard, so we have sanitation problems there as well. So just poor air quality, poor sanitation everywhere, overcrowding. It just made living in most areas of Butte just not the healthiest situation ever. So we look at those factors and how it might have impacted someone's immune system and their immune response. It really shouldn't be surprising to us then that there was so much susceptibility to influenza during this time. What I thought was really interesting is that in 1912, Silver Bow County report pinpointed specific neighborhoods. So those statistics I mentioned earlier about how many people per room and how many cubic feet of airspace they figured out came from specific neighborhoods in Butte. And what that report found was there is an area in Butte, kind of this rough Maltese cross shape, where about 70% of the city's tuberculosis deaths occurred. And those are where those statistics on living condition come from, is those particular neighborhoods. So I had a thought. I said, if they can take that and pinpoint susceptibility to tuberculosis and tuberculosis mortality rates, maybe we could do the same for influenza and see if there's any correlation there. So that's exactly what I did. So of those 707 death certificates, I was able to map a little over 500 of those deaths, place them somewhere on here. And what I found is that a little over 50% of them took place in that rough cross-shaped area there that the Board of Health pointed out as being the unhealthiest portions of the city. Then, if we take an even closer look into that area of the city, so what we have, and I stopped using my notes, so you're going to have to give me a second here while I get caught up. So what we have in this kind of area of uptown is we have a line kind of going across on Park Street, a line going down on Main Street, and so this area from about probably here over doesn't exist anymore. That neighborhood, it's not there. But what we found is that was actually, if we take a look, one of the unhealthiest portions of the city, according to the numbers from that report, to live in. So we see that in the east part of this area here, we have the highest number of deaths from influenza, and also the highest number of immigrant deaths from influenza, which the high number of immigrant deaths should come as a surprise because that's where the immigrant neighborhoods were. So, if you're wondering about colors here, I kind of tried to code roughly where some of these immigrant populations lived in those neighborhoods. So remember, I mentioned that and this is right, really excited. I mentioned that the Finnish immigrants had a particularly high mortality rate. Well, this blue area right here, east of Main Street, about the 400 to 600 block of Broadway and Park was Finntown. So we have this really, crowded, poor living condition neighborhood there with a lot of our Finnish population. We've got Centerville up here, with the Cabbage Patch, Dublin Gulch, Chinatown in the Red Light District, and then kind of these other, what are labeled as like mixed ethnic neighborhoods where predominantly immigrant populations, just no specific group live there. But I thought it was very interesting that we can kind of look at those numbers and say, wow, in these immigrant neighborhoods, as the Board of Health found, were typically the ones with the poorest living conditions, and we see here the highest numbers of influenza deaths. So I think if we look at that, we really can make this correlation here between living conditions condition and influenza mortality. I think the numbers make it very clear that living condition played a huge role in susceptibility, not just those factors of age, gender, and occupation.
Now there are 8 colored.
So, here's my notes here. So, and there's a map that the nice folks here at the archives gave me that kind of helped organize where these immigrant neighborhoods were and kind of overlaid it with the map I have here. So these are rough approximations, of course, of where these groups live. But this orange up here, we have Centerville, we have Dublin Gulch, the dark green, the light, brighter green is kind of about where the Cabbage Patch was. So you see kind of our Irish and our Cornish, maybe a little bit of our English neighborhoods. We've got the approximate location of Finntown, so we have a lot of Scandinavian and Northern European immigrants there. We've got, again, kind of these areas that were just labeled as like mixed ethnic. So some other immigrant groups, we have the Eastern Europeans, the Serbians, and those type of neighborhoods. And then these little spots right here, we have the red light district in Chinatown, approximately. So. And I'll talk a little bit more about the red light district in Chinatown here in a couple of minutes. I keep saying the other important and unique thing about Butte, because there are so many unique things about Butte, but the other thing that's very unique about Butte and its diverse population was its response culturally to the pandemic. Butte was pretty lucky in the fact that they had a very proactive Board of Health. The public health authorities were very proactive in recognizing what was going on and trying to stop it. Rather than, a lot of communities you'll read about during this time really try to keep things under wrap and keep it quiet because it's wartime and we don't want to scare anyone or dampen morale. But the authorities in Butte we can look back and say, they did what they could to try to stop this. So some of the things they did to prevent widespread devastation by this contagious and deadly plague were to, early on, to order public gathering places closed. So shops, churches, theaters, even what was termed bargain sales, so big sales in department stores so we don't have a lot of people crowding in there at once to buy things. Closing those things. Businesses that were allowed to stay open were required their employees to wear masks and to fumigate or just to sanitize every day, and that applied, from offices to, the streetcars and that. They placed a prohibition on large funerals, so only immediate family members were allowed to attend funerals during this time, and just some strict crowd control measures, and calling in the National Guard and enlisting the help of the police department to disperse crowds on the streets. I read some stories about, a housewife getting fined for sweeping a bunch of dust out into the street because that was believed to stir up the germs and things. And there's some other kind of humorous now anecdotes about people getting fined and even arrested for spitting on sidewalks and all kinds of things like that. So a lot of control measures put in place to try to prevent the spread, and many of them would have been successful. That's what we do to mitigate things like influenza is crowd control and social distancing. So they really did have the right idea, but it did not go down well for a lot of this population. They just weren't willing to follow those for some very, I think, from some very good reasons for most people. The places that caused the most trouble for public health authorities were saloons, pool halls, and then churches. And another historian I recently just read that wrote a little bit about the pandemic in Montana called these three things, he used the term strange bedfellows. And it's kind of true because they kind of worked together to work against the Board of Health and the regulations that the board imposed to try to control influenza. So, but these kind of three places, especially in Butte's ethnic neighborhoods, really they were very important. They're the center of the community. So news outlets. You know, a lot of people would go to the, you know, some young single minors might stay overnight at the local tavern. There's a story, I think it was called the Glendive, and it had always had a big pot of stew on the stove in the back for people, and, you know, roll out your bedrolls at night when the bar closes. So they were really important. It was, a lot of them, it was more than just a place for the miners to go have a drink after work. It was kind of a second home. So a lot of the saloons that were told to close their doors between a certain time or not sell liquor at a certain time ended up being closed altogether by the Board of Health because they just kept violating those orders. There were always more people there than there were supposed to be. They refused to shut down entirely because they believed their communities needed them. And it kind of was the same with churches. Some of the churches, the clergy had a lot to say about canceling services and things like that because they were so important to their communities. You know, and the clergy, you know, I read an article from like one of the local papers where one of the clergy members was just outraged because one of the saloons could stay open even though they had these restrictions and he couldn't hold services. So there was a lot of pushback here. And I think it's safe to say that there were a lot of clergy members and saloon owners and pool hall establishments that skirted these rules or just violated them outright. So some other things to look into, and these are things that I have yet to look into a little bit. A big one that I really wanted to look at was how was influenza treated in 1918 and 1919? People didn't really know. Doctors couldn't figure out exactly what they were dealing with. The influenza virus itself wasn't discovered until the 30s, and then it wasn't until the 90s that scientists were able to isolate the particular strain from 1918, 1919. So back in that time, doctors had really no idea what they were dealing with because the disease that they were seeing was so much more severe than the influenza they were used to. They were kind of at a loss. So they tried all kinds of things. So diphtheria, smallpox, and tetanus serum, even injecting patients with those, thinking, well, it helps cure these other terrible things that we're dealing with, so maybe it'll help us out here. Home remedies and alternative treatments. So people wearing garlic and camphor around their necks, you know, opium, whiskey, whatever you could find just to make yourself feel better because there was nothing else to do. Patent medicines had a huge year in 1918. So we have names like Vicks VapoRub and Lysol today, thanks in part, I suppose, to the pandemic in 1918. But really the only thing that could do much help for people was the type of comfort care and symptom kind of easement that nurses could provide. Doctors, for all of their training and their scientific and their medical knowledge, they were at a loss. They really didn't know what to do. You know, some doctors thought, you know, there were some that looked at this, especially if they saw patients that were turning black with cyanosis and thought, we're dealing with the medieval Black Death again, it's back. There was a doctor in Chicago that said, you know, I think it's all this rationing and this war diet that we're on, and we're not getting enough sugar, and that's what's making us all sick. There were some people that blamed the Germans because in 1918 and the rest of the early 20th century, you blame the Germans for everything. So they're making us sick. They just really didn't know what to do. So nurses were, as they are, I firmly believe today, they were worth their weight in gold during this time, and there were just not enough of them. But the question that the thing I was kind of thinking about, I'm like, all right, so we have all of this cultural diversity in Butte during this time. Did that play any role on how the city and its residents treated influenza? You know, did these immigrant ethnic groups, did they have their own ways of treating the disease that, you know, were unique maybe to other communities? So I wanted to learn a little bit more about that. It's turning out to be chasing a golden goose, trying to find those types of records. But I was actually, and I can add this now, I was up here yesterday, and the lovely folks here at the archives had some information. I was looking at Chinatown in the red light district and, you know, how it worked there. And there was an article in the Butte Miner, a Chinese doctor said, hey, I have a way of curing this flu. And none of the Chinese people have died, and I don't remember now exactly, even though it was yesterday. But it was somehow with packing salt under the armpits and in the groin, and it would draw the toxins out. Then he said, I just put a needle in and I draw out all of this black stuff, and that's all the toxins, and it cures influenza. So that's what the Chinese did. I don't know if it really worked to cure influenza, or if they were just lucky and managed to get through unscathed, but I thought that was kind of an interesting anecdote yesterday. The other thing I thought was really interesting about Butte was that there's a lot of stories from other industrial cities. Pittsburgh is mentioned a lot because they had a high mortality rate, but about how after the pandemic, since they lost so much of their workforce, the young men had been so susceptible and so many had died, there was a labor shortage in many of these industrial cities that consequently increased wages. So I thought, well, wouldn't that we'd expect that in Butte, you know, if we're losing a lot of our young men and our workforce, but that didn't happen in Butte, which I thought was really interesting. One of the Anaconda's, my bosses, said, you know, even during this time with all the people sick, we didn't have trouble getting men to work. I had just as many men come to work every day as I normally did. So I think from that we really just have to look at just how mining worked in general during those days and how transitory it was, and how if you don't go to work, there are 3 guys that are there that can show up. You know, and you know, we have a lot of failures and labor disputes during this time, and I think all of those maybe kind of played a role in that, so that Butte didn't have, you know, it really wasn't economically affected by the pandemic like a lot of industrial cities were. Finally, and this is one of the things that makes researching this topic, at least for me, so very frustrating, because there's so few stories and anecdotes and really information about what went on. So finding out the effect of so much death and illness on the city's collective psyche, like how did people react to this? How did the city respond to all of this? Because most histories really don't talk about it too much. The focus is on World War I and the armistice and everything else happening during this time, but I might have a bunch of people argue with me, but I'll say I think the pandemic had a lot bigger impact on the population of the U.S. maybe than this war that we're in for a year and then claimed victory for. So again, you can probably argue with me about that, but the fact is we really don't have much about this in the history books. And maybe because, you know, it was just a terrible time and nobody wants to talk about it anymore. So for our medical community, our public health community, I think we can look at it as a learning experience. After 1918, influenza became a reportable disease, and public health is, by law, doctors are required to report all cases of influenza to public health to follow up and investigate. Narratives from the medical community on the pandemic are really optimistic. You know, they don't talk about it as this terrible time. They're like, yeah, we learned a lot, and our nurses just performed great, and our doctors did everything they could. So they don't talk about some of the failures, maybe, that they had seen. And the other thing is there's influenza, like most biological forces, there's just no control. You can't control it. And I think what people really want, not only then but now, is we want control over our lives and what happens to us. And people couldn't control influenza and what it did to their communities and to their families. So I think that might be one of the reasons that the oral histories and the personal histories that we have for this time tend to focus on family and jobs and things that people could control, the more positive events of their lives. So, you know, unfortunately, there's not a lot for us to dig into, but we take what we can and run with that. In conclusion, so again, I just want to keep stressing, this is less than a year, less than 1 year, a few months here in Butte even. Montana lost 1% of its population to influenza, 1/3 of those here in this city in just a few months. Demographics played a huge role, and here in Butte, the working conditions, but especially just living in the city and how it was then, played a huge part in that, especially the social and the cultural diversity that Butte had during that time. So Butte's demographic makeup, combined with the working and living conditions and unique social and cultural makeup its mining economy created, made it especially susceptible to influenza in 1918 and 1919. And there is so much that I could say about this topic and this city that I've just, just really grown to love because it is so unique and has such an amazing history. And I think this is just one more kind of layer to add to, just the really tumultuous time in early 20th century that was here in Butte. Here's a list, if there were any interested, and I'm happy to answer any questions later and talk about any of these, but these works, and I've added a few to this list since then, have just been invaluable to me. There are a couple of great works on the pandemic itself, and then works about Butte and its culture and its population and life in the city during this time have been absolutely valuable resources to me. And I'd be happy again to answer any questions, or even later as people go. But I just wanted to thank you again for coming today and thank the folks here at the archives for allowing me to be here again. I love any opportunity to come back west and visit here and talk to, I teach high school, so many opportunities to talk to an audience that has volunteered to listen to me. It's fantastic. So, yes.